believe these income levels become an important part of the conversation because a lot has been said recently about economic and social rights on the one hand and economic growth on the other. So it's interesting that we are leading into that now. And I think I will now invite Elizabeth to speak to us about that, about why there's an either or, and to help understand this better. So Liz, thank you for being here. Uh, I'll just start off with the either or question. Could you help us understand why economic and social rights, or human rights generally, and economic growth have received so much attention of late?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. So to answer that question, recently the High Commissioner on Human Rights has actually talked about the human rights economy. And so it's pretty well acknowledged that human rights and economic factors are interlinked. But one of the big questions that keeps popping up is exactly how. And so the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as sort of has already been discussed, right, requires countries to devote their maximum available resources to progressively realize economic and social rights. And this formal commitment has actually often led to improvements in economic and social rights over time. But it's also the case that some policymakers are concerned that focusing on human rights actually comes at the cost of decreased growth. And so in some countries, like the United States, where I'm based, this has also sort of evolved into this political opposition to ESG, or environmental social governance frameworks. And the basic argument is that prioritizing anything other than the bottom line, such as say like the education or the health of the workforce, inherently lowers profit and therefore will lead to lower economic growth in terms of GDP as well.
So it's interesting, but where does this concern come from? And from whatever you have, whatever your findings are, do you think these concerns are valid?
Yeah, so I think it comes from a little bit of that language of the ICSCR. So because it requires prioritizing economic and social rights first, there is at least some reason that people may be concerned that the steps that are taken to fulfill economic and social rights are actually in direct conflict with the steps that would improve economic growth, and vice versa, right? So for example, in the economics literature, it's well established that technological innovation is essential for economic growth. And one of the ways that often occurs is that governments invest highly in higher education. But what that means is they have less resources to then invest in broader access to education for everyone, right? So in that case, the right to education and right improving economic growth would sort of be in conflict. But on the other side of it, there's also some evidence that they could be mutually reinforcing. So for instance, policies that prioritize broad access to education, or say access to healthcare, those inherently get at those rights to education and health in particular. But it's also the case that they have the potential to benefit businesses and additionally the broader economy, because a more educated, healthy workforce is inherently more productive. And so where we are right now is we're at this place where there's a lot of potential theoretical connections between economic and social rights and economic growth. And we really need to turn to that empirical evidence to inform, right, what we're actually seeing on the ground. And as of right now, that empirical evidence is still pretty inadequate. And so we should be using data in order to sort of see what's really going on with the connections between the two.
So Liz, how do you think can we use data actually to sort of better inform these relationships that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so one example is a brief analysis that we did where we were actually trying to look at the connection between economic and social rights and economic growth. And we used the newest data that was just introduced from Hermy. We specifically focused on the income adjusted quality of life scores, as well as the 5 individual indicators of the rights to education, health, housing, food, and work. And we combined those scores with data from the World Development Indicator, so publicly available data there too, that measured GDP per capita annual growth rates. And we used an already established methodology in the economics literature. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to sort of show what this looks like. So we broke countries up into 4 different groups based on 2 dimensions, right? So on the left here, we have how they performed on ESR, and I'm using the right to housing as just one example of how we could do this. And then on the top, we have how they did on GDP per capita growth. And we compared country performance to the median for all countries that we actually had data for. And so if a country was performing above the median on this right to housing, and also above the median on GDP per capita growth, we classified that country as virtuous, right? So this is the best case scenario. They're doing well on both of these dimensions. The opposite is where they're doing below the median on their ESR score and also below on growth. And we called that vicious, which would be the worst case scenario. For countries that did well on ESR scores, but less well on growth, we call those housing lopsided, or more generally ESR lopsided. And then for countries that do the opposite, where they have relatively high growth rates, but then lower ESR fulfillment, we call those growth lopsided. And so what we did was we took the data for 2010 and we put all of the countries that we had data for in one of these 4 quadrants. And then we look at where they ended up 10 years later in 2020, which is the newest data that we actually have available.
That is fascinating. So just for people who are viewing us right now, could you tell us more about what these data exactly show us?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you the results for the right to housing scores in particular. So the sort of first thing that you see here is we have this big red bubble in the virtuous category with the 44% in it. And the way that we read this figure is for countries that started out in the virtuous category in 2010, 44% of them remained in that category 10 years later in 2020. Another 44% of them transitioned from the virtuous category in 2010 to the housing lopsided category in 2020. And so notice the arrow going from the virtuous to the housing lopsided quadrant. 3% of them moved from virtuous to vicious, and then another 8% moved from virtuous to growth lopsided. And so this general pattern that we see for countries that started off in the virtuous quadrant here, we see something very similar when we look at countries that started off in the vicious category. So here, right, 51% of countries that started in the vicious category in 2010 remained in that category in 2022. 5% moved from the vicious category to housing lopsided. 3% went from vicious to virtuous, and then 41% went from vicious to growth lopsided. And so the general pattern that we see here is that for countries that started either in the virtuous category or in this vicious category down here, we tend to see that they're likely to stay there. And so one of the things that this implies is that when a country falls into this vicious category, this bad category, it's actually really difficult to escape. But on a more positive note, if they're able to make it to this virtuous category, then the benefits are likely to be enduring, at least for this 10-year time period that we're looking at. And the other thing that this sort of shows us is the paths that countries take to different quadrants. And so if we look at countries that started in the growth lopsided category here, so 48% of them remained in that category 10 years later. 36% of them transitioned from the growth lopsided category to vicious, 10% went to housing lopsided, 5% to virtuous. And so we see this very clear pattern with countries that started in the growth lopsided category. They're either likely to stay there or they're likely to transition to this vicious category, right? Very few of them actually go into housing lopsided or virtuous. And so what this sort of implies is that in the absence of ESR fulfillment, maintaining rapid economic growth is actually quite difficult, right? We see that many countries actually end up transitioning to this bad category down here without the ESR fulfillment. But on the other hand, if we look at countries that started off as housing lopsided, right, 59% of them stay in that category. Another 30% transition to the virtuous category. 5% go to growth lopsided, and 5% go to vicious, right? So again, this is a really clear pattern in the data that we're seeing, where countries that start in this housing lopsided category, they either remain there or they transition to this virtuous category. Very few of them are moving to growth lopsided or to vicious. And so what we take from that is that countries that actually do a better job of fulfilling their obligations under international law, they tend to enjoy a growth benefit in the next decade. Or in other words, right, the path to this good category of virtuous seems to go through, right, this ESR fulfillment here. And so just before I stop sharing my screen, I want to point out that this is the data specifically using the right to housing scores, but we did this for all 5 of the ESR scores and the overall quality of life score. We also actually looked at different time periods as well. And we found that these patterns are actually robust across all of those different analyses. So this is sort of a very strong result that we're seeing here. So I'll just stop sharing for a minute.
So Liz, if we were to quickly sum this up in terms of where this leaves us, how can we continue to use data to keep learning more about this?
Yeah, I mean, so the results are really promising here. And I think what they show is there doesn't really appear to be this conflict between economic and social rights and growth that people are concerned about. And actually, rather, they're mutually reinforcing, right? So they work together in this positive way. And so given a lot of the current conversations around ESG, but also these broader concerns about prioritizing human rights over growth, there's at least some evidence that maybe these concerns are a bit overblown. But it also shows that the best path to that virtuous category, right, where countries are doing really well on both economic and social rights fulfillment and growth, is occurring by prioritizing economic and social rights over growth itself. I guess what's still missing from this is the mechanisms through which that occurs, or the specific steps that countries actually have to take in order to get to this positive outcome. But that's actually where Hermes data can be really useful. In addition to showing these broad patterns in the data, right, it can point out specific country cases where we could dig into policy prescriptions that lead us to those good outcomes. It can also help us look at some of the more disaggregated factors so we can really learn as much as possible about the relationships we're seeing here.
Thank you so much for that, Liz, and for basically showing us that economic growth and human rights can be mutually reinforcing.